The scent of money, old and new, mingled in the air at Aurelia, a gilded cage in the heart of Manhattan, where the chandeliers wept crystal tears and the sommeliers spoke in hushed, reverent tones. For Clara May Riley, a 24-year-old art history scholar disguised as a waitress, it smelled of desperation, specifically the quiet, gnawing desperation of her grandmother's mounting medical bills for a heart that was giving out one exhausted beat at a time. She moved between the tables with a practiced invisibility, her mind a gallery of Flemish still lifes and impressionist landscapes. This job was a performance, a masterclass in self-effacement. You existed to anticipate, to serve, to disappear. You were a ghost in a starched black uniform, even as you balanced plates of seared foie gras that cost more than your monthly textbooks. Clara was good at it. She had to be. Her scholarship to Columbia barely covered tuition, and this job, with its rare but life-saving tips from the city's elite, was the only thing keeping her and her grandmother afloat in their tiny Queens apartment. Her keen eye, honed by years of studying brushstrokes and provenance, had found an unlikely application here. She could spot a fake Rolex at 20 paces, discern the difference between bespoke tailoring and off-the-rack by the drape of a shoulder, and read the subtle tells of a patron's mood in the clench of a jaw or the tap of a finger. Her most frequent and most dreaded occupants of Table 4 were Julian Croft and his fiancée, Genevieve "Vivi" Davenport. Julian Croft was a scion of one of New York's oldest families, but he was no indolent heir. He had taken his family's crumbling, old-world shipping and acquisitions empire and dragged it, kicking and screaming, into the 21st century with ruthless efficiency and brilliant foresight. He possessed a stillness that was unnerving, his steel-gray eyes constantly assessing, calculating. He wore his legacy like a perfectly tailored but suffocatingly heavy wool coat. He wasn't cruel to the staff, but he was perpetually encased in a cocoon of preoccupation, his focus always on some distant horizon only he could see. Genevieve, however, was a creature of the present, a masterpiece of curated perfection. Her beauty was architectural, all sharp angles and flawless surfaces, her voice a melody of condescending grace. To Julian, she was the adoring, supportive partner, the perfect addition to his perfectly rebuilt life. To the staff, she was a silent storm of impossible standards and quiet disdain. "This Pellegrino," Genevieve had said to Clara just last week, gesturing vaguely at the bottle. "It's not cold enough. The condensation on the glass should be uniform, not patchy, and I specifically requested a lime wedge, not a wheel. Does no one listen?" "My deepest apologies, Miss Davenport. I'll have it replaced for you at once," Clara had replied, her smile a carefully constructed mask. "See that you do," Genevieve had murmured, dismissing her with a flick of her wrist before turning her dazzling smile on Julian. "Darling, I was just telling my father about the new wing for the Met. Your family's contribution will be the talk of the gala." Julian, as usual, had simply nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Whatever you think is best, Vivi. The family name must be upheld." Clara had retreated to the service station, her hands trembling not with fear, but with a contained fury. It was the casual dismissal, the way Genevieve made her feel like a poorly rendered detail in the grand painting of her own life. Julian saw a partner. Clara saw a predator who had mastered the art of camouflage. She often wondered what he, a man who had wrestled an empire back from the brink, saw in a woman whose only discernible skill was projecting an image of effortless class. They were the city's royal couple, their every move chronicled in the society pages. But from where Clara stood, the royalty looked more like a meticulously crafted forgery. It happened on a crisp October evening. Aurelia had been bought out for a private affair, a fundraiser for the New York Historical Society, hosted by Julian Croft himself. Clara, known for her discretion and efficiency, had been specifically requested to work the event, a grueling but lucrative 12-hour shift. The venue wasn't the restaurant, but Julian's own penthouse apartment, a sprawling space on the Upper East Side that felt less like a home and more like a private museum. She was circulating with a tray of champagne flutes when she saw it. Hanging in the grand salon, illuminated by a single, perfectly angled light, was The Merchant's Wife by a 17th century Dutch master, a painting she knew intimately. It was the jewel of the Croft collection, a piece she had written a 40-page paper on just last semester. It depicted a woman of severe beauty, her hands clasped, a single luminous pearl earring catching the light. Clara froze, the glasses on her tray rattling softly. From across the room it was perfect, but as she drew closer, her trained eye picked up the infinitesimal tells, the discordant notes that screamed a lie. The craquelure, the fine network of cracks on the paint surface, was too uniform, too deliberate. It lacked the organic, chaotic pattern of 4 centuries of aging. The shadow beneath the woman's jaw, a notoriously difficult passage of chiaroscuro, was subtly flattened. It lacked the master's signature depth. And the pearl was the final, damning clue. The original was famous for its almost liquid, translucent luster. This one was flat, opaque. A good copy, an excellent copy, but a copy nonetheless. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just a fake. It was a forgery of audacious skill, hanging in place of a masterpiece worth tens of millions of dollars. Shaken, she continued her rounds, her mind racing. An insurance scam? A secret sale? She was refilling glasses near the terrace when she saw Genevieve slip outside, her glittering gown shimmering in the city lights. A man was waiting for her in the shadows. He was not Julian Croft. He was Alistair Finch, a charismatic but ruthless art dealer known for operating in the gray areas of the market. A man whose name was whispered in connection with stolen and forged masterpieces. Clara had seen his picture in art journals. He was Julian's professional rival, a shark who had tried and failed to orchestrate a hostile takeover of a Croft subsidiary 2 years prior. Genevieve didn't see Clara in the darkened doorway. She reached up and touched Alistair's face, her touch proprietary, familiar. "Is it done?" Genevieve's voice was a low murmur, stripped of its public grace. "The transfer cleared this morning," Alistair replied, his voice a smug purr. "The authentication papers I provided were flawless. The buyer in Dubai is ecstatic. He thinks he has the real merchant's wife. By the time Julian's auditors notice the discrepancy from the restoration fees, we'll be untouchable." Genevieve laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "He's so obsessed with his family's legacy, he can't see the rot in his own house. He looks at that dreadful woman on the wall every day and sees his grandmother's pride. He's a fool." "A very rich fool," Alistair corrected, pulling her closer. "And you, my love, are about to be a very rich widow-in-waiting. Once you're married, with your hands on the family trusts." He leaned in and kissed her, a hungry, conspiratorial kiss that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with conquest. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. This was a breathtakingly evil plot. They hadn't just stolen the painting. They had sold it, replaced it with a fake, and were siphoning the money. And it was all a prelude to a larger goal: gutting the Croft family fortune from the inside after the wedding. They were betraying Julian's trust, his heart, his family's history, and his entire future. She backed away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. What could she do? Who would believe her? A waitress against the word of the city's most beloved socialite? To speak up was professional suicide. Genevieve would have her not just fired, but utterly destroyed, her name dragged through the mud until no one in the city would even hire her to wash dishes. Her grandmother's care would evaporate. Her dreams of a career in art history would turn to dust. But to stay silent, to watch this happen, to serve champagne to these vipers as they toasted to the destruction of a man who, for all his remoteness, was their victim. It felt like a betrayal of everything she believed in. Art to her was about truth, and this was the ugliest lie she had ever seen. For 3 days, Clara lived in a state of quiet panic. She went to work, she studied, she cared for her grandmother, all while this monstrous secret coiled in her gut. She had decided reluctantly to say nothing. It wasn't her world, it wasn't her fight. Then came Friday night. Table 4 was booked. Julian and Genevieve. The tension at their table was a palpable thing. Julian was unusually quiet, his brow furrowed as he stared at a tablet displaying market reports. Genevieve was in overdrive, her laughter a little too loud, her stories a little too bright. She was also, as a result, particularly cruel to Clara. "This quail," she said, pushing her plate an inch away after a single bite. "It's over-seasoned. The chef is usually so precise. Is he having an off night, or is your palate simply uneducated?" "I will inform the chef of your feedback, Ms. Davenport," Clara said, her voice even. "Don't bother," Genevieve sighed dramatically. "The moment is ruined. Just bring me the check. Julian, darling, we should leave. The energy in here tonight is simply common." As Clara walked away, she heard Julian's weary voice. "Vivi, for God's sake, it was a bird. There's no need to be so sharp." "I'm not being sharp, darling." Genevieve's voice was like ice. "I am upholding a standard. It's what our life is about. It's what your family name is about. You must never tolerate mediocrity, Julian. Not from your staff, not in your business, and certainly not in your art collection." That was it. The mention of art, the sheer, staggering hypocrisy of her words, snapped something inside Clara. She returned with the check. Genevieve had gone to the powder room, leaving Julian alone, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked like a king besieged in his own castle. This was her chance, her only chance. Her mind screamed, "Don't do it, walk away, think of your grandmother." But her heart, her conscience pounded a different rhythm. Tell him the truth." She placed the leather bill folder on the table. "Mr. Croft." He looked up, his gray eyes tired, unfocused. "Yes." "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice a low, trembling whisper. "I know this is not my place. I know you have every reason to fire me on the spot for what I'm about to say. But I have to." He frowned, his full attention finally locking onto her. The full force of his focus was like a physical blow. "What is it?" "It's about Ms. Davenport," Clara said, her pulse thundering in her ears. "And it's about your painting, The Merchant's Wife." At the mention of the painting, a flicker of interest pierced his weariness. "What about it?" "The painting in your salon, sir. It's a forgery, a very good one. But it's not the original. The craquelure is wrong, the chiaroscuro is flat, and the luster on the pearl is incorrect." The words tumbled out, precise, academic, the one language she was truly fluent in. I also saw Ms. Davenport on the terrace during your fundraiser. She was with Alistair Finch. I heard them talking. They sold the original. They're stealing from you." The silence that followed was absolute. The lively hum of the restaurant faded into a dull roar in Clara's ears. Julian Croft's face, which had been weary, transformed. It went through a rapid, terrifying series of changes. Confusion, then a flash of cold comprehension, and finally a deep glacial fury. But it was not directed at his fiancée. It was directed entirely at her. "What did you just say to me?" he asked, his voice so quiet it was more menacing than any shout. "I'm telling you the truth, sir. I study this period. I know the piece. I saw them." "You know nothing," he interrupted, his voice a low, shaking hiss of rage. "You stand there in your uniform, and you dare to concoct this insane, slanderous fantasy? An art critic now, are we? What is this, a shakedown? Are you working for Finch? Did he put you up to this to try and destabilize me?" "No, Mr. Croft, I swear, I just thought you deserved to know the truth." "The truth?" His laugh was a short, ugly bark. "The truth is you are a waitress, wildly and offensively out of your depth." At that exact moment, Genevieve returned, gliding to the table like a swan. "What's happening, darling? You look furious." She cast a dismissive glance at Clara. "Oh, let me guess. She forgot the extra olive again?" Julian didn't look away from Clara. His eyes were like chips of ice. "This employee was just giving me her expert opinion on my family's art collection. She claims The Merchant's Wife is a forgery and that you are conspiring with Alistair Finch to defraud me." Genevieve's perfectly made-up face went through a flicker of pure, animal panic, so fast that if Clara hadn't been watching for it, she would have missed it. But it was instantly masked by a look of theatrical disbelief and hurt. She let out a brittle, condescending laugh. "Oh, darling, how absurd! Her—" She turned her venom on Clara, her eyes narrowing. "Let me tell you what this is. This is the pathetic jealousy of the lower class. They see a life they can only dream of, a life of beauty and legacy, and they try to tear it down with sordid, ridiculous lies. She probably has a crush on you and thinks this little psychodrama will get your attention." She placed a hand on Julian's arm. "Julian, this is an insult to me and an insult to your family. Have her fired. I don't want to see her face ever again." Clara's world shrank to the space between the three of them. "Mr. Croft, please, just look at the painting. Look closely." Julian looked at Genevieve's wounded face, then back at Clara's desperate one. He was a man who had built his life on control, on projecting an image of unassailable strength. A cheating fiancé and a stolen legacy was a narrative of chaos, of weakness. A disgruntled fantasist waitress was a problem that could be neatly, efficiently solved. He raised a single commanding finger, and the restaurant's manager, Monsieur LeBlanc, materialized at his side. "Mr. Croft, is everything to your satisfaction?" "No," Julian said, his voice flat and final. He gestured at Clara without gracing her with a look. "This employee has been harassing my fiancé with delusional and malicious fabrications. I want her removed from my site, immediately." "But sir," Clara whispered, her last hope dying. "If she is still employed here when I wake up tomorrow morning," Julian continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper LeBlanc could not mistake, "I will pull not only my personal account, but the accounts of all 6 of my major corporations. And I will make it my personal mission to inform every one of my associates that the discretion at Aurelia is no longer guaranteed." LeBlanc turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked at Clara with pure, unadulterated loathing. "Miss Riley, my office, now. You are dismissed." "Monsieur LeBlanc, please, I was only—" "Now!" he barked. Tears, hot and humiliating, burned her eyes. She took one last look at Julian Croft. He was meticulously straightening his silverware on the tablecloth, his expression a blank mask, as if she had already been erased from existence. Genevieve watched her go, a small, triumphant smile playing on her perfect lips. Clara turned and walked the long, terrible walk of the damned across the dining room, the eyes of every patron like daggers in her back. She had armed a man with the truth, and he had used it to execute her. As the kitchen doors swung shut behind her, the last thing she heard was Genevieve's light, victorious laughter, a sound like shattering glass. The weeks that followed were a descent into a specific circle of hell, reserved for the righteous and the ruined. Clara was not just unemployed, she was a ghost. Monsieur LeBlanc had made good on Julian's implied threat, blacklisting her so effectively that every fine dining establishment in the city seemed to know her name and the vague, slanderous story attached to it. The temp agencies offered her dishwashing gigs and overnight shifts at Greasy Spoons, jobs that paid a fraction of what she needed for her grandmother's new round of medications. The eviction notice on their apartment door was a constant, flapping reminder of her failure. She had gambled her life on a powerful man's decency and discovered he had none. Meanwhile, Julian Croft tried to excise the incident from his mind. He told himself Clara was an unhinged employee, a pawn in some game of corporate espionage by Alistair Finch. He doubled down on his trust in Genevieve, burying himself in preparations for their upcoming wedding and the annual Croft Foundation Gala, the crown jewel of the New York social season. But Clara's words were a corrosive acid, eating away at the foundations of his carefully constructed reality. The craquelure is wrong. The chiaroscuro is flat. They weren't the words of a simple liar. They were specific, technical. They were the words of someone who knew. He started watching. He'd always implicitly trusted Genevieve's taste, her management of their social and domestic life. Now he saw things through a new suspicious lens. He noticed the restoration fees for the painting from a firm he'd never heard of, a payment authorized by Genevieve. He noticed her sudden, intense interest in the legal framework of the family trusts, documents she'd always found achingly dull. He saw her take a call, her back to him, her voice a low, urgent whisper, and the way she'd flinched when he entered the room. The splinter of doubt became an agonizing wound. One night, unable to sleep, he went to the salon. The house was silent, the city a glittering tapestry beyond the vast windows. He stood before the merchant's wife. For his entire life, this painting had been a symbol of his family's endurance, of quiet strength. Now he looked, really looked. He pulled up a high-resolution image of the painting from the Met's digital archives on his tablet. An image taken before its recent restoration. He started comparing, and the world began to fall away. The waitress, Clara, had been right. The craquelure in the archive photo was a chaotic spiderweb. The one before him was a neat, orderly grid. The shadow under the jaw in the photo had an almost imperceptible depth, a faint warmth to the umber. The one he was looking at was a solid, lifeless black. He zoomed in on the pearl earring, the soul of the painting. In the archive, it was a universe of reflected light. Here, it was a dollop of white paint. The truth hit him not like a wave, but like a silent, catastrophic collapse of a dam. It was a fake. The waitress, the girl he had dismissed and destroyed, had seen the truth in a single glance from across a crowded room, while he, who had lived with it his entire life, had been blind. The blindness, he realized with a sickening lurch, was willful. He hadn't wanted to see. Admitting the painting was a fake meant admitting something was deeply, fundamentally rotten in his perfect life. Admitting Clara was right meant admitting Genevieve was a liar. A cold, terrifying calm settled over him. It was the same icy focus he got before a hostile takeover, when emotion was a liability and only ruthless strategy remained. The fog of love, of denial, was gone, burned away. He now knew he wasn't just dealing with an affair or a petty deception. This was a sophisticated, long-term conspiracy to dismantle his family's legacy from the inside out. He spent the next 2 weeks in a secured bunker of an office, not sleeping, just working. He didn't contact his usual security team. Genevieve knew them. He hired an outside firm of forensic accountants and private investigators, the best in the world. He had them trace the shell corporation that billed him for the restoration. He had them track Alistair Finch's movements, his finances. He had them find Clara May Riley. The report on Clara came back first. It detailed her academic record, summa cum laude. It detailed her grandmother's medical history. And it detailed her current, desperate situation. The eviction notice, the low-wage jobs, the crushing debt. He read it and felt a shame so profound it was physically painful. He hadn't just fired a waitress. He had tried to break a brilliant, honest woman. The reports on Genevieve and Alistair were even more damning. The forensic accountants unraveled a complex web of offshore accounts, tracing the sale of the real painting through a series of intermediaries to a shell company owned by Alistair, with a final payout scheduled for an account in Zurich under a name Genevieve would assume after their marriage. The private investigators provided photos of her and Alistair meeting in secret and audio recordings where they discussed their plans in smug, contemptuous detail. "He'll be so busy playing the grieving husband after your unfortunate riding accident next year," Alistair's voice said on the tape. "He won't even notice the trusts are empty." Julian listened to it all, his face a mask of stone. They weren't just planning to rob him. They were planning to kill him. He looked at the invitation on his desk, embossed with the Croft family crest. The Croft Foundation Gala, the event of the season. Genevieve was the chairwoman. It was her masterpiece of social climbing, and it would be her stage, he decided. But she wouldn't be the star of the show. She would be the centerpiece of the slaughter. The ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was a breathtaking sea of black tie and couture. 300 of the world's most powerful figures in finance, politics, and art had gathered for the Croft Foundation Gala. Genevieve was the queen of the night, resplendent in a custom-made crimson gown, the legendary Croft diamonds, a pre-wedding gift from Julian, cascading around her neck. She stood beside him, her hand on his arm, the perfect image of beauty and devotion. Alistair Finch was there too, schmoozing with a museum curator, playing his part as a respected, if sharp-elbowed member of the art community. Julian played his part as well, smiling, shaking hands, the proud, besotted groom. He felt strangely detached, an actor in the final scene of a play he had rewritten. After the main course, Julian took to the stage. A hush fell over the magnificent hall. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice calm and steady. He smiled warmly at Genevieve. "Tonight is about celebrating legacy, about the truth and beauty that art brings into our lives. It's about preserving the treasures of the past for the future, and it's about honoring the people we trust to help us guard that legacy." He turned his gaze to the audience. "My fiancée, Genevieve, has been the most extraordinary guardian of my family's heritage. Her taste, her dedication, it's unparalleled." Genevieve glowed, drinking in the praise. "In fact," Julian continued, "to celebrate her commitment, I have arranged a small surprise, a centerpiece for tonight's auction." On cue, two attendants wheeled a large object covered in a velvet cloth onto the stage. "This is a piece that has been in my family for generations. It recently underwent a significant restoration, and I am thrilled to unveil it to the world for the first time tonight." With a flourish, Julian pulled away the cloth. There it was, the merchant's wife. The room broke into appreciative applause. Genevieve's smile was frozen on her face, but her eyes held a flicker of confusion. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Julian said into the microphone. "But in the world of fine art, beauty is not enough. We need certainty. We need truth, which is why I have flown in a very special guest tonight from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Annelies Schmidt, the world's foremost expert on 17th century Dutch masters." A distinguished gray-haired woman walked onto the stage. Alistair Finch, standing near the back, had gone rigid. Genevieve's hand, resting on her father's arm in the front row, was gripping him like a vice. "Dr. Schmidt," Julian said, his voice still unnervingly pleasant, "would you do us the honor of confirming the authenticity of this masterpiece for our guests before?" The applause that erupted was a monstrous, crashing wave. It was a sound of shock, of morbid thrill, of a public execution perfectly staged. Julian remained at the podium, a statue carved from ice, his gaze fixed not on the pandemonium below, but on the gaping void where Genevieve had stood. He had expected to feel triumph, a righteous, cleansing fire. Instead, a profound and desolate emptiness washed over him, so vast it threatened to pull him under. He had exposed the rot, yes, but in doing so, he had been forced to display his own gangrenous wound to the entire world. The rot was his. He had cultivated it, nurtured it, planned to marry it. Genevieve did not scream or protest further. The fight drained from her in an instant, as if a puppeteer had snipped her strings. Her face, a moment ago a mask of theatrical outrage, collapsed into something horrifyingly blank. It was the face of a beautiful automaton that had just been unplugged. The Croft diamonds at her throat, no longer glittering with reflected glory but seeming to absorb the light into a dull leadenness, were a heavy yoke on her slender neck. Security, his security, flanked her. She did not resist as they gently, irrevocably guided her away from the stage, her crimson gown a smear of blood against the marble floors. She vanished into the wings of the grandest stage she had ever conquered, a ghost at her own coronation. Alistair Finch was less composed. His fury was a tangible thing, a spitting, feral rage. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers, Croft," he snarled as the federal agents pushed him towards an exit, the flash bulbs of the press photographers catching the feral glint in his eyes. "This is a setup, a corporate vendetta." His words were drowned out by the rising cacophony. Julian looked out at the sea of faces, the titans of industry, the doyens of society, the cultural gatekeepers. They were all staring at him, their expressions a mixture of pity, morbid fascination, and a cold, calculating respect for the sheer brutality of his maneuver. He had not just ended an engagement. He had annihilated a reputation, dismantled a conspiracy, and reasserted his dominance in the most public way imaginable. But as he absorbed their gazes, he felt a sickening wave of self-loathing. He had used the truth as a weapon, as clinically and ruthlessly as he would use a poison pill in a corporate takeover. And in the center of it all, he had spoken her name, Concreme Really. The realization of what he had done hit him with the force of a physical blow. In his quest for a public, undeniable justice, in his desperate act of penance, He had taken this intensely private, courageous woman and thrown her to the wolves. He had turned her integrity into a soundbite, her suffering into a plot point in his grand drama. He had paid his debt to her on a public stage, making her a character in his narrative without her consent. The shame was a physical taste in his mouth, metallic and bitter. He had taken her truth, the purest thing he had encountered in years, and tainted it by making it his. He didn't wait for dessert. He walked off the stage, ignoring the hands that reached out to him, the murmurs of support from men who admired the kill. He pushed through the ornate doors of the museum and stepped out into the biting October air. The sirens were already wailing in the distance, a fitting score for the wreckage he had left behind. He was free, yes, but he had never felt more alone, more trapped within the prison of himself. He was Julian Croft, the man who had been so blind he needed a waitress to show him the truth of his own life, and who in his gratitude had repaid her by making her a target for the world. For Clara, the aftermath was not a dream, but a prolonged, waking nightmare. The money appeared first. It was not a settlement check, but a silent, almost terrifyingly large sum deposited into her bank account by a law firm she'd never heard of. It came with a single, sterile letter explaining it was the initial disbursement from an irrevocable trust established in her name by an anonymous benefactor for services rendered and damages incurred. It was more money than her grandmother had earned in a lifetime of backbreaking work. It was enough to secure the finest cardiac specialists in the country to move them from their cramped Queens apartment to a sun-drenched brownstone in a quiet, leafy neighborhood. It was enough to guarantee she would never have to serve another quail or polish another wine glass for as long as she lived. And she hated it. She hated it because it felt like an invoice. It was a price tag placed on her humiliation, her terror, her professional ruin. It was a transaction, a closing of a ledger. You were wronged. Here is your compensation. We are now even. It felt cold, impersonal, and utterly devoid of the one thing she craved, a simple human acknowledgement, an apology. Then came the fame, or rather, the infamy. Julian's speech had turned her into a public commodity, the waitress with the golden eye, the Cinderella who toppled a socialite. Her face, captured from an old student ID, was plastered across the front pages of the tabloids. Reporters camped outside her old apartment building, harassing her neighbors. News vans staked out the library at Columbia. Her quiet, anonymous life, the one she had fought so hard to maintain, was gone, incinerated in the flashbulb glare of Julian Croft's public spectacle. She became a recluse. She dropped her classes for the semester, unable to face the whispers and stares. The new apartment, beautiful as it was, felt like a gilded cage. She spent her days coordinating her grandmother's care, the fierce joy of seeing her grow stronger and breathe easier, warring with the gnawing anxiety that coiled in her stomach. She was grateful, profoundly so, for her grandmother's health, but she felt a deep, simmering rage at the man who had forced this gratitude upon her. He had solved her problems with a checkbook, the tool of the powerful, while simultaneously creating a whole new set of them. He had not saved her. He had simply exchanged her cage of poverty for one of celebrity. 3 months after the gala, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived, delivered by a private courier. There was no return address, but she knew. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was not a legal document, but a single sheet of heavy stationery filled with elegant, angular handwriting. Clara, I know I have no right to contact you. I know that no words can undo the damage I have done. The financial arrangements I made were not a payment, but a crude and insufficient attempt at restitution. They were a craftsman's repair for a wound that required a surgeon. For that coldness, for that transactional insult, I am sorry. My greater crime was what I did at the gala. I used your name, your story, as a shield for my own pride and a sword against my enemies. In my attempt to honor you, I violated you. I thrust you into a spotlight you never sought and exposed you to a world you had every right to be protected from. It was a selfish, arrogant, and unforgivable act. I have spent every day since replaying that moment, consumed by a shame so profound it has reshaped the very architecture of my life. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I have not earned it. I am asking only for 10 minutes of your time, to apologize to you in person, not as a benefactor to a beneficiary or as a character in a tabloid story to another, but as a man who was blind to the woman who gave him sight. You can name the time and place. If you choose to throw this letter away and I never hear from you, I will understand. I will not contact you again. Julian. Clara read the letter 3 times. The rage she had been nursing for months began to recede, replaced by a confusing swirl of emotions. The words were not those of a billionaire settling a debt. They were the words of a man who had been gutted, a man who understood the precise nature of his crimes. A craftsman's repair for a wound that required a surgeon. He saw it. He finally saw it. She waited a week in which she wrestled with her pride, her fear, and a sliver of unwilling compassion. Finally, she wrote back, a short, simple note. A cafe in the West Village, Veselka, Saturday, 2 p.m. Clara. It was a place he would never go. It was loud, crowded, and unapologetically unpretentious. It was her territory. He was there when she arrived, sitting at a small table in the back, looking profoundly out of place. He wore a simple gray wool coat and jeans, but he couldn't disguise the innate stillness, the aura of power that clung to him like cologne. He looked older than he had on stage. There were new lines etched around his eyes. He stood when he saw her, a gesture of respect that felt genuine. The first few moments were thick with an almost unbearable awkwardness. A waitress took their order for coffee, blissfully unaware that she was serving the 2 most infamous figures of the New York social season. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, his voice low. "You wrote a good letter," she replied, her voice more brittle than she intended. "Did you have your PR team draft it?" The question was a deliberate test, a sharp little jab to see if he would flinch. He did, but he didn't get defensive. He simply met her gaze, and his eyes were filled with a weary sadness. "No," he said quietly. "There is no one on my staff who could articulate the depth of my failure. Those words were my own." She believed him. She took a sip of her coffee, the warmth of the mug a small anchor in the churning sea of the moment. "My grandmother is doing well. The doctors you found, they're miracle workers. Thank you for that. It was the least I could do. It was the only part of this entire mess that felt clean." He hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table. "Clara, I know the money is a burden, a reminder. I've instructed my lawyers to place it entirely under your control. You can donate every cent of it. You can set it on fire. It is yours. My only hope was that it would buy you freedom. Instead, I seem to have only bought you a different kind of prison." "I'm not a story, Julian," she whispered, the words raw with the pain she had suppressed for months. "I'm not a character in your redemption arc. I am a person. You made me into a symbol." "I know," he said, and his voice was thick with remorse. "And I will spend the rest of my life regretting it. I spent years surrounded by forgeries, forged art, forged emotions, a forged life. And when I finally encountered something real, something authentic, I didn't know how to handle it. So I put it on display. I treated you like a masterpiece to be authenticated. It was monstrous." They sat in silence for a long time after that, the clatter of the diner filling the space between them. For the first time, Clara saw past the billionaire, past the victim of a grand betrayal. She saw a man profoundly, devastatingly alone, a man dismantling the ruins of his life, brick by painful brick. It was not the beginning of a friendship. It was the beginning of a truce. They started to meet infrequently at first, always at her choosing. Small, anonymous museums on weekday afternoons, crowded bookstores where no one would recognize them. They didn't talk about Genevieve or the gala. Instead, they talked about art. But their conversations were different now. He was no longer the collector, and she no longer the scholar. They were 2 people trying to understand the nature of truth. They stood before a Rothko, and he spoke of how a man could stare at a canvas of pure color and feel an emotion so profound it bordered on pain. She spoke of the Japanese art of kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold, the philosophy being that the object is more beautiful for having been broken. Their conversations were a form of kintsugi, a careful mending of the jagged edges between them. She learned about the changes he was making. He had sold the penthouse, the museum in the sky. He had restructured the Croft Foundation, redirecting its vast resources away from lavish galas and toward a new fellowship program that provided full, unconditional funding for promising, low-income graduate students in the arts and humanities. The first fellowship was named the Riley Grant. He hadn't told her. She read about it in an academic journal. When she asked him about it, he looked almost embarrassed. "Legacy shouldn't be about preserving what you have," he said. "It should be about building what the world needs." She began to see the man he was becoming, not the man he had been. The arrogance had been replaced by a quiet humility. The ruthless efficiency was now channeled into a thoughtful philanthropy. He listened more than he spoke. He asked her about her dissertation, not to seem interested, but because he was interested. He remembered the names of the obscure Siamese painters she loved. He never once overstepped. He never tried to turn their meetings into dates. He seemed content with the fragile, tentative connection they had forged, as if he knew he had no right to ask for anything more. It was this restraint, this profound respect for her boundaries, that finally allowed the walls around her heart to begin to crumble. Almost a year to the day after the gala, he called her. "The painting has been recovered," he said. There was no triumph in his voice, only a deep weariness. "The authorities in Dubai cooperated. It's back in New York." "What will you do with it?" she asked. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "Hanging it in my home feels wrong, profane. But I would like you to see it before it goes wherever it's going." He didn't take her to a vault or a gallery. He took her to a quiet, private conservation studio in Brooklyn. It was a large white room, smelling of turpentine and linseed oil, filled with the gentle, focused energy of restoration. And there it was, resting on a heavy easel under the pure, unforgiving light of the studio. The merchant's wife. The real one. Clara felt the breath catch in her throat. She stepped closer, her scholar's eye taking in the truth of it. The craquelure was a beautiful, chaotic map of time. The shadow under the jaw held an impossible depth. And the pearl earring seemed to contain its own internal light, a liquid, living luster that no forger on earth could ever replicate. It was truth on canvas. "It's magnificent," she whispered. "It is," Julian agreed, standing beside her. "It's also a symbol of my family's greatest pride and my own deepest shame. I look at it and I don't see a masterpiece. I see my own blindness. I see you trying to warn me. I see me breaking you for telling me the truth." He turned to face her. The light from the large studio windows illuminated the sincerity in his eyes. "I'm giving it away, Clara. I'm donating it to the Met. Anonymously. My family name doesn't deserve to be attached to it anymore. Its provenance from here on will be about its recovery, about the truth being restored." He reached into the pocket of his coat. She braced herself, expecting a box, a gesture. But he didn't pull out a piece of jewelry. He pulled out a single key. It was a simple, old-fashioned brass key. "I am not the man I was," he said, his voice quiet but steady in the silent room. "That man died the night of the gala. I have spent this past year trying to build someone new from the wreckage, someone who values truth above comfort, someone who understands that true wealth isn't what you own, but what you see clearly. And I cannot see clearly without you. You are my provenance, Clara. You are the source of whatever authenticity I now possess." He held out the key. It rested on the palm of his hand. "This isn't a locket or a diamond. It's the key to my apartment. It's not a proposal wrapped in a promise of a glittering future. It's just an invitation to come inside, to build something new with me, something real, something that doesn't need a perfect frame because its truth is self-evident." Tears streamed down Clara's face, hot and silent. This was not a fairy tale ending. Fairy tales were forgeries, perfect narratives that glossed over the ugly broken parts. This was something far more precious. It was real. It was two broken people choosing to repair their lives with the gold of shared understanding. It was a legacy built not on inheritance, but on excruciating, hard-won truth. She didn't say yes. She simply reached out and took the key from his hand, her fingers closing around the cool, solid brass. It was an anchor. It was a beginning. He watched her, his gray eyes full of a vulnerable hope that was more moving than any declaration of love. He didn't kiss her. He just covered her hand with his, their fingers intertwining, a silent, binding contract. And together they turned back to the masterpiece, no longer seeing a painting but a reflection of their own story, of a priceless truth, lost and found.